Good morning, folks. I thought we would try a little bit of Honest 250 this morning, a little bit of honest representation of what was going on 250 years ago today in terms of commemorating the American Revolution, remembering it, discussing it, reconsidering it. So if we were 250 years ago today on September 3rd, 1774, what the main event that is going on is the meeting in Philadelphia of the delegates to the First Continental Congress. They're starting to gather, they're getting the rooms in boarding houses, and they are starting to get a feel for one another. This is the first time that many of the patriot leaders have met in person, particularly in terms of the radical patriot leaders. It's very difficult to travel up and down the colonies in 1774. So this is their first time to, in fact, meet in person. They have engaged in correspondence with one another. They have obviously read their stuff in terms of pamphlets and newspaper essays, but they have never, few of them have ever met. John Adams has never been out of Boston. But he is in Philadelphia for this, along with Samuel Adams, along with a number of others. So what I wanted to share with you this morning in terms of understanding where the radical patriot leaders were in terms of things like independence and questions of that versus accommodation with the British Parliament versus some sort of resolution to their differences that is short of independence. Here is a nice snippet from today, 250 years ago, from the diary of John Adams. Again, Adams has just arrived in Philadelphia. He is staying at a boarding house in the city, but he has breakfast this morning and meets for the first time the Lee brothers, Richard Henry Lee and Arthur Lee, who are considered the most radical of the patriots, certainly the most radical of the Virginia patriots. Arthur Lee, problematic in all kinds of ways, but whom Adams is taken with is Richard Henry Lee, probably the most famous of them at the time. So here is what Adams has to say about his breakfast and the day that he has with Richard Henry Lee and some of the other delegates. He breakfasted at Dr. Shippen's. Dr. Witherspoon was there. This is Dr. Witherspoon, the delegate from New Jersey. Colonel Richard Henry Lee lodges there. He is a masterly man. This Mr. Lee is a brother of the Sheriff of London. The Sheriff of London was William Lee. We talk about sort of colonial representation in Britain. William Lee, Virginian, brother of Richard Henry Lee and Arthur Lee, had been elected Sheriff of London, which was one of the major political offices in London at the time. And of Dr. Arthur Lee and of Mrs. Shippen. They are all sensible and deep thinkers. And here's where we get into where they are in terms of independence. Richard Henry Lee being the most radical of the Virginia Patriots. Lee is for making the repeal of every revenue law, the Boston Port Bill, the bill for altering the Massachusetts Constitution, and the Quebec Bill, and the removal of all the troops, the end of the Congress, and an abstinence from all duty articles, the means, rum, molasses, sugar, tea, wine, fruits, etc. He is absolutely certain that the same ship which carries home the resolution will bring back the redress. If we were disposed that any time would intervene, he should be for exceptions. He thinks we should inform His Majesty that we can never be happy while the Lords Bute, Mansfield, and North are his confidants and counselors. Okay, so let's unpack this just a little bit. So Richard Henry Lee is focusing on 3 of the Coercive Acts. He thinks that the end of Congress, as Adams put it, that the goal that Continental Congress should achieve is the repeal of the Boston Port Bill, which is the first of the Coercive Acts. Close the port of Boston until the Bostonians pay for the tea that was destroyed in the Boston Tea Party. The altering the Massachusetts Constitution, that bill was the Massachusetts Government Act, which removed the town meetings, basically took away all of the political rights, constitutional rights of people in Massachusetts, and put it more or less under martial law. And that was seen as a common cause, particularly for Virginians. The Quebec Act, which established established a government for Quebec that gave Catholics rights. And the removal of all troops. They sent troops to Massachusetts in order to enforce the Massachusetts Government Act. That should be the goal of the Congress, is to construct a resolution that called on Parliament to do that. And the means by which they would pressure the government to do that, in Richard Henry Lee's in Richard Henry Lee's point of view, a non-importation and non-consumption agreement, a boycott, economic measures, not political ones, not military ones, certainly not independence, but economic measures. Stop consuming or importing rum, molasses, sugar, tea, wines, fruits. And that Lee thinks that the same ship that carries that resolution, we're going to go ahead and not consume or import all of these goods until you repeal these things and you remove the troops, that the British government will respond quickly. That the same ship which carries home the resolution, 30 days, will bring back the redress. That they'll respond positively to all of these things and get all of these things done. And he thinks that there should be a separate letter that goes from that Congress to George III. And this is where a little bit of the conspiracy theories come in. That we can never be happy while the Lords Bute, Mansfield, and North are his confidants and counselors. Lord Bute hasn't really been a part of the British government for a very long time, but he is the great boogeyman. He hasn't been prime minister since 1763, so he hasn't been prime minister for 11 years at this point, but he's still this mysterious figure that some radical patriots believe is pulling the strings of George III. Mansfield, the Earl of Mansfield, who presided over the case in the Somerset decision, just 2 years earlier in 1772. So he believes that Mansfield himself is actually also a part of one of the counselors, part of advising George III in bad ways. And Lord North, who of course is in fact the first minister at the time, that he is getting, and this is a long-standing criticism, manner of opposition criticism in British and in more particularly in English history, that do not criticize the king, criticize his counselors. He's getting bad information. This is something that happened a lot during the 17th century until Cromwell really got into power. Do not criticize Charles I. It's not Charles I's fault. That could end up being treason. In the 17th century, criticize the counselors. So he's getting bad counsel. He's getting bad advice. Remove them. Execute them. But you can sort of leave the monarch alone. This is kind of still in that mindset, although by 1774, you can criticize the king. It's not socially acceptable to do, and it could be a little politically dangerous, but it's not absolutely fatal. In any case, that's what he wants. Richard Henry Lee. So it gives us an idea of where the most radical of the Virginia Patriots are when it comes to what's going on with Parliament, what the First Continental Congress should do, what they should ask for, and how they should go ahead and put pressure on the British government to achieve this. Now, it's very interesting that Adams goes further with Richard Henry Lee. And points out that he attempted a calculation of the numbers of people represented by the Congress and made it about 2.2 million, which actually isn't far from the actual population of the colonies. But of course, that includes enslaved people, who are 1 out of every 5. And the other interesting thing that he points out, that Adams points out, is about what they get up to during the course of the day. Adams says he spent the evening at Mr. Mifflin's with Lee and Harrison, Benjamin Harrison from Virginia, the 2 Rutledges from South Carolina, Dr. Witherspoon, Dr. Shipton, Dr. Steptoe, and another gentleman. An elegant supper, and we drank sentiments till 11 o'clock. They had toasts. Lee and Harrison were very high, which means they got wasted. He had been drinking all day long. Richard Henry Lee and Benjamin Harrison. Lee had dined with Mr. Dickinson, John Dickinson, and drank Burgundy the whole afternoon. Harrison gave us for a sentiment a constitutional death to the Lords Bute, Mansfield, and North. This is what happens after they get very high late at night. This language comes out. So there's your your honest history snapshot from 250 years ago today, supplied by none other than the honest John Adams. Let me know what you think, particularly about the position of the most radical of the patriots, Richard Henry Lee, in what the First Continental Congress was there to do, what was their means to achieve it, and what's not there. Any discussion whatsoever of independence, not even in the cards.